When I was 16, I would sneak out of the house at night to get high and read a book. There was an empty foreclosed home next door, and I would get inside via a basement window. I'd smoke in that basement's bar area. One night, it was raining pretty heavily, and I'd forgotten to bring my lighter. I went to get it, and it was still pouring when I got back. I set up a comfy place at the bar and turned on my camping lamp that I kept there. I started hearing these weird noises upstairs though. I turned off the light and sat still for a moment to listen in a bit closer. That's when I realized the sound was not coming from upstairs. It was actually coming from a doorless room right next to me. I grabbed everything I could and made for the window. With half my body through, I heard someone running and shouting behind me. I felt someone grab my foot from behind just as I managed to crawl outside. I got out of their grip and ran to my house, where I snuck in as quietly as possible. I heard sirens soon after I made it into my house, worried it was law enforcement that had caught me in the home. The sirens went on for a while into the night, and I could barely sleep at all. I learned the next morning that someone on the next block over had burned their mother's home down with her in it. He had been found breaking into a home later that night that was occupied, several doors past the house I had been in. It was likely that was him in the basement with me trying to hide, and he switched spots after I got away. I still get scared whenever I think about it. Growing up, my parents added on to our house, and this left my bedroom as the only one upstairs. My sister and I had a shared room at one point, and are still to this day extraordinarily close. It wasn't uncommon for her to just wander into my room and sleep in my bed in the middle of the night, or vice versa. I woke up in the middle of the night one time to see a hand scrambling around between the edge of my bed and the wall. I immediately assumed that my sister had slept in my bed and fallen off the edge or something, then grasped the side of the bed and was reaching out like that to try and grab something desperately in a blind panic. Thinking my sister might need help, I looked over the edge of the bed, but I didn't see anything on the floor. I scurried down the stairs and slept in my sister's room that night, where I found she was sleeping peacefully. There was no further incident. When I went to look under my bed the next day, I didn't find anything either. When I was in college, I made some money by modeling. Sometimes I would just let photography students take pictures of me for practice. Other times I'd work with professionals on fetish shoots. One day I saw an ad on Craigslist. Standard creepy Craigslist deal. Amateur male photographer seeking woman willing to pose nude for him to practice his art and also add to his private collection. It was summer and my jobs on campus had dwindled down to nearly nothing. I needed money really bad, so I replied to this very sketchy ad. The guy wanted me to take a bus to the big city, several hours away from the small town where I went to college. Then I would meet him at his studio, and I would be paid $200 to model for him. He said I could bring a male friend for safety if I wanted. He was not expecting anything more than modeling. He promised it would be okay. He was a normal man in his 40s with a professional job as a doctor, and he just wanted more practice at his hobby. I was desperate to make rent, so I said sure. We set a day. The day of, he emails me to make sure I'm coming alone. I said no, I'm bringing my friend as we'd previously agreed. At this point, the emails started getting a bit weird. I got this feeling in the pit of my stomach that things were not all okay with this guy. I stopped replying to the emails and obviously did not go to the gig. Life went on as usual. 2 years later, I'm living in another state. but just so happened to see a news story on Facebook. It was about the trial of a professional man, a doctor in his 40s, who was on trial in the big city for murdering a woman who had answered his ad for a nude model. He'd murdered her in quite a horrible way based on the details from the news story. I'm certain it was that exact same ad I had seen. The same man I had emailed for the gig I had almost taken. That murdered girl was almost me. My mother's family lived on the second floor of a larger duplex. The front doors to the second floor apartments were located on the side of the buildings and faced each other from one duplex to the other. They rarely locked the front door, and everyone knew their neighbors quite well. One morning, one of my uncles, who must have been about 13 at the time, says he woke up very early. This was summertime, and although it was kind of light out, the sun hadn't actually risen yet. It was still practically in the middle of the night. He was half awake in his bed and a bit groggy when he realized what had awoken him. It was the sound of someone creeping along the corridor. For some reason, something didn't feel right to him. It didn't sound like someone from the family was going to the bathroom during the night. It was much slower and careful. He called out, "Hey, who's there?" He then heard whoever was in the corridor walk back to the top of the stairs, down the other side, and then out the front door. That's creepy enough in my opinion, but it gets much worse. Within 6 months of this event happening, a teenage girl was found dead in the duplex next door to my family's home. She had been killed in the middle of the night with a hammer by a 15-year-old boy that lived nearby. He was known by all the other kids of the neighborhood, and my mother remembers him as being very quiet and always kind of looking down or away whenever you would look at him. He was kind of an outcast, certainly because of his personality, but also perhaps a bit because he went to a posh school, thanks to his father being the janitor there. He was a bit of a snob to the other kids in the duplex where my family lived. On the first floor, there was a family with 3 teenage girls. In my family, there were 2 teenage girls. I guess he knew what he was looking for, because he had been lurking around for a good while, deciding which one of us he wanted to take out with his hammer. After he was caught, he killed himself while in the hospital. He was still a very young man. When my friend was about 11 or 12 years old, she went to an all-inclusive resort with her family. This was one of those big places with several pools, restaurants, kids areas, etc. Her dad bought her walkie-talkies, one for her brother, and one for the adults. This was before cell phones were a big thing, so they wanted to be able to stay in touch just in case the kids wanted to go off and do their own thing or something. One night, her parents and her brother go down to the restaurant for dinner. My friend wasn't feeling very well though, so she asked to stay back in the hotel room and watch a movie on her own. They agreed and gave her the walkie-talkie for emergencies. She was up there for about an hour or so, checking in periodically with her dad, just to say hello or ask what they were doing or whatever. She started to feel really sick at one point though, and asked her dad, "Hey, when do you think you'll be back to the room?" Her dad answered back, "We're coming up right now, sweetie. I forgot the room number. Could you tell me what it is again?" As soon as she was about to answer, her dad's voice cut in. "Hey, we're coming back up right now. We got you some cake because you weren't feeling good. We'll see you in about 5 minutes. She knew that the second voice was her dad. She locked the door until her parents got back, and when they did, they said they hadn't talked to her on the walkie-talkie all night long. So back sometime in January of 2013, I was up late suffering from insomnia and watching Moonrise Kingdom. I live in Canada, and this particular night the temperature was holding steady in the single digits. It was probably around 2 or 3 degrees out. The roads were like sheets of ice. The only thing I had to eat in my home were oyster crackers and ketchup, so I decided to pause the movie for a while, bundle myself up tight, and brave the frigid wastelands outside to go and grab some snacks from the mini-mart a few miles away. After putting on several layers of clothing, I stepped outside and locked the door to my townhouse behind me. I walked over to my car. It was so cold out, it was actually kind of hard to breathe. For a moment, I reconsidered going at all, but my hunger overpowered my discomfort. I chiseled the ice off my windshield and climbed inside my car. I put the key in the ignition and started the car. I also immediately turned on the heater, but not the headlights just yet. As I was waiting in the inside for the car to warm up, I noticed a red Cavalier drive past me down the street and pull into the driveway of the townhouse that was just around the corner from my own. Not having much to occupy my time as the car slowly heated up, I watched as 3 people exited the Cavalier. My heart immediately began to race as I noticed that one of the people in this car had his hands tied behind him. The man who had been in the back seat with this bound man immediately smacked him with what looked like a tire iron, and the defenseless man collapsed into the snow. The tire iron man kept beating him, striking at his legs and back. I could see red patches of blood starting to stain the snow around the fallen man. For some context, this was sometime after midnight, so there was no traffic or anyone else around outside. The only light illuminating the street was coming from about 3 or 4 surrounding streetlights. I didn't recognize any of the men, but I could faintly hear them shouting at each other. I couldn't catch their exact words, though. The man who had been in the driver's seat came around the side of the car and pulled out a handgun from his jacket. I remember actually shouting, "Oh, fuck!" before clamping my hands over my mouth. I was convinced I was about to witness a murder here, and I was terrified. There was no sense of excitement or grim fascination. This was not a movie. This was a violent, unscripted reality. I was suddenly feeling very traumatized. I hadn't set out tonight wanting to be a witness for what was possibly about to be a murder. My car was on and running, but so was theirs, which was probably why they hadn't noticed me. I didn't dare to try and sprint back inside, but I also didn't want to try my luck driving down the icy street, where they could have easily chased after me if they chose to. The driver bent down and put his gun to the head of the bleeding man. He remained in that position for a while. I assumed he must have been saying something to him. I began to let myself breathe easier, daring to hope they were just going to get back into the car and drive away without killing the man. Then I could call him an ambulance. I had my cell phone in my pocket. Now, you might be asking, if I had a phone, why wasn't I calling the cops right now? This is Canada, and the cops don't give a shit. I also didn't want to risk making any noise or giving my position away with the light of my phone screen. You may think this was cowardly of me, and maybe it was, but until you've been in a situation when there's a guy with a gun 50 yards away from you, I'd say you've got no right to judge me. Anyway, this whole time, the guy with the tire iron had just been standing there. No hat, no gloves, and in the freezing cold, staring down at the bleeding man. Well, my car's engine suddenly stuttered. He glanced up and looked right toward me. I swear I felt my heart stop for a moment. He just stared in my direction. I froze like a deer in the headlights, praying he wouldn't see me. I'm a pretty scrawny guy and wouldn't have had a chance of defending myself against this dude, even without him having a weapon. Suddenly, he began to make his way across the street towards me. Maybe he'd noticed the cloud of exhaust coming from my car or he was just trying to get a better look. Either way, my fight-or-flight mode kicked in. I wasn't going to wait for this guy to get closer. I killed the engine, leapt out of my car without even shutting the door, and sprinted as fast as I could toward my front door across the icy driveway. I heard the guy yell behind me, "Hey, you!" I was convinced that at any moment I would hear a gunshot. Then suddenly I would hit the ground and bleed out, with the lights starting to fade. But thank God that never happened. I reached the front door and frantically stuffed my keys into the lock. As I turned the knob, I heard the tire iron guy curse and hit the ground. I guess he had slipped onto the ice. I didn't turn around to find out though. Once inside, I slammed the door and locked it. I immediately barricaded myself in the guest room, which only had one small window facing the backyard. I left all the lights off and laid down on the ground next to the bed. My heart was racing, breathing heavily, expecting at any moment to hear pounding from the front door. But it never came. I lay there cowering for what felt like 20 minutes when I heard footsteps out in the hallway. I clamped my hands over my mouth to muffle my breathing and strained my ears for any sound outside the bedroom door. I'd never heard the front door open, but the soft, steady thudding of heavy feet coming down the carpeted hallway was very clear that someone was there. I told myself that as soon as I heard the doorknob jiggle, I was calling the cops on my cell phone and telling them my house was on fire. That would get them there real quick. After a moment, though, I thought I heard the footsteps in the living room. Then, nothing at all. I was convinced the intruder was hiding somewhere in my own home, waiting for me to emerge so they could pounce on me. That was the absolute longest night of my life. I waited wide awake and terrified, convinced I was going to die. When the sun eventually came up, I found the courage to leave the bedroom. I picked up an empty wine bottle to defend myself as I walked down the hall. I carefully peeked outside. There were 2 police cars parked outside my neighbor's yard, and the Cavalier was gone. I didn't recall hearing any gunshots. I walked into my kitchen and took a look around. That's when I noticed my back door was unlocked. My heart sank as I noticed one word had been carved into my wooden table: quiet. About an hour later, the cops knocked on my front door and informed me there had been an assault last night. My neighbor was in the hospital. They asked me if I had seen anything. I lied and said I had passed out at midnight watching movies and had just woken up right now. That might have been a crappy thing to do, but I didn't want to have my name be involved. Whoever these men had been, they were unstable and dangerous and knew where I lived. I didn't want to have to be dragged into court to testify against them. The police asked me if I knew my car door was slightly open. I said no. I simply shrugged and stated I might have forgotten to slam it shut earlier in the day. They seemed to buy that and left without any further questions. I threw out that table and got a new one, and have since put a new security system in place. I'm not particularly proud of how I acted that night, but I have no particular regrets either. Had I tried to be a hero, I might have been killed, so call me a coward if you want. At least I'm still alive. I never made another attempt to go on a late-night snack run ever since, though. I think this story will be improved by context about the setting and such, so here we go. First, the story took place after I graduated high school and moved away from my family. I moved up to Alaska again. I say again because I lived there once before for a short while I was attending college there. Second, and very conveniently, my mother had been renting out our old house instead of selling it. I say conveniently because the long-standing residents had moved away, and therefore I was awarded the old house. I had to work quite a bit to keep up the payments, but my mother pitched in, thankfully. At the beginning of this story, I should make you aware that I had recently broke up with a girl who had been staying with me in that old house. I was renting through my mother, and this breakup was unclean and dysfunctional, much like the relationship itself was. Finally, the story begins. It was winter break, which meant I would be spending much more time inside than I normally would. It was feeling somewhat lonely in this house all alone, without my girlfriend around any longer. There were also no neighbors to really speak of, as the house was in an extremely wooded region. It was a few miles out of town. One late afternoon, soon after I'd thought the whole breakup fiasco had come to a close, I was made quite aware that it wasn't done just yet. My cell phone began ringing non-stop, and I saw that it was coming from an unknown number. Cliché, I know. I decided to pick up and see what was going on. It was, of course, my ex. She began telling me about how great her new boyfriend was and how horrible I am. The sort of talk you can just smell the booze off the caller's breath from miles away. I actually listened, though, until she decided to hand the phone over to her boyfriend. He was, of course, very threatening to me. I decided to hang up in the most politeful manner possible, with a "fuck you, have a nice day." Days later, my mind began to forget about this incident. It had most certainly just been a drunken phone call. We all do that every now and again, so whatever. I'm lying there in the living room, watching some TV. While laying there, though, I noticed something quite unsettling out of the corner of my eye. As I observed closer, I could see a person standing in the window behind me. You may ask me how I noticed this. Well, I could see his reflection from the TV screen. I didn't move an inch, though. I had no weapons to defend myself. I had no guns, no knife. I had nothing but my wit and my fists, so I just lied there watching this reflection, pretending I hadn't noticed. Eventually, it did move away from the window. Normally, that wouldn't spook me too much, but taking into account that this house was nowhere near any others, that was a big red flag. If someone was just wanting to talk to me, why wouldn't they knock on the door? For some reason, I was almost certain it was that new boyfriend. Nothing came of the situation that night, though. Unfortunately for me, similar situations continued to occur from then on, though. A car pulling into the driveway, no one getting out, and then leaving after idling there for a while. It was conspicuous and quite worrisome. I didn't suspect a true threat, though, until a few days later. I was lying in bed and it was very late at night. I was getting ready to fall asleep when I get another call from an unknown number. It was her again, but this time she was asking me to come outside. She said she wanted to give me an apology. At the time, I was thinking I should just tell her to fuck off. I still decided to go outside, though, and see what the deal was. I opened the door and it was incredibly dark outside. I say on the phone that I'm outside, and she tells me to come around back. With this, I began to walk on the snow-covered ground in the darkness, with just my boots on. The motion light turned on as I crossed the garage and driveway. The snow masking the ground was tinted yellow by the light. I rounded the corner of my garage and turned my phone to see the road that runs behind my house and connects to the driveway by bending. I made my way towards that road, the snow crunching beneath my boots. As I made my way closer, there was a part in the trees that allowed me to walk straight to the road. Otherwise, no one could make their way around the entirety of the driveway. I reached this part and I asked into the phone, "Where are you?" "I'm in the car. I see you." I stepped onto the road and saw her parked in a car a few dozen feet away from me, with the lights dimmed down. "So what's the deal here?" I asked her. "I just want to talk. Come here." I approached the car and made my way around to the passenger side. I saw her face and she waved me in. I got into the car and sat down. She says to me, "Look, I'm sorry. I know I've been a real bitch lately." No, it's okay. I wasn't really good to you either. I guess I deserve some ribbing. She abruptly stopped speaking because a pair of car lights shined from behind us. Naturally, I assumed it was her boyfriend, and by the look on her face, she did too. The car parked behind us, and sure enough, the boyfriend gets out and storms over to my side of the car. He yanks the door handle and the door swings open. He attempts to grab me, but I grab his wrist instead and jump out of the car. What do you think you're doing with her, huh? We were just talking, dude, and I was just about to leave. You're trying to fuck her, aren't you? Look, I'm trying to get back and sleep. I'm in no mood to do anything like that, you piece of shit. He gave me this look of utter enragement before swinging at me. He missed, though. A scuffle ensued. Most of what happened, though, was him swearing and slipping and falling before yelling at us both that he'd kill us. I just stood by her car as he pulled away. She gave me a lift back to the house, and I invited her inside. It was late in the night, and I suggested she lock her car if she was going to stay. We slept upstairs in my bed before I awoke hours later. There was a banging at the back door. I knew this because the back door was directly below my room. She woke up too. I stood up quickly and went to my closet. I reached behind all the coats I never wear and grabbed my Louisville Slugger. She was sitting upright in my bed with her hands covering her eyes. I didn't say anything before walking down the stairs, attempting to be silent. The lights were off and there were no windows on the staircase. The pounding on the back door had audibly ceased. I held the bat tightly, making sure not to bang it against anything and accidentally give away my position. I remember just how slowly I was stepping down, especially the bottom 3 steps, which were always the creakiest ones. I reached the final step, and I froze. It still gives me chills to this day, the sound of the hardwood floors creaking at the bottom of the staircase. There was also a creaking approaching me that was growing closer and closer. I raised the bat above my head, ready to slam whoever it was right on the top of their dome. The creaking grew ever closer, and I planned to swing as soon as it was in front of me, as the staircase opened to the left from the bottom. I had never listened so carefully, holding my breath. I squeezed my hands tighter than I ever had before around the bat, waiting for whoever this was to emerge from around the corner. The creaking sounds were now directly in front of me. I slammed the bat down hard, and I hit something. Whatever it was crumpled to the floor with a bang and a small flash. I turned on the light, and there he was. The boyfriend had fired his gun directly into the floor and left a hole in the hardwood. My ex came downstairs crying profusely, muttering she was sorry over and over again. I called the police, and 4 cops pulled into my driveway, along with an ambulance. I sat at the base of the stairs watching the boyfriend. He was still breathing, I could tell that much from his chest slowly inclining and declining off the floor. I grabbed what I thought was a 9mm off the floor and kept it in my hand, with the safety turned on. I just shook my head over and over in utter disbelief. I explained the situation to the police as the paramedics rushed in and carried him out on a stretcher. All in all, I didn't get much sleep until late into the afternoon, after everything was done and over with. The man ended up going into a coma, but eventually he did recover. A restraining order had already been filed in advance. My ex and I became good friends after the incident, and she never dated that guy again. I never ended up moving out though. I had considered it, but nothing like that has happened ever since, and I don't really expect it to happen again either. So there you have it. When my friend and I were maybe 10 years old or so, we were walking from my house to her house, a 5-minute walk at most. To get there, we could either go around the long way, or we could cut through a schoolyard. The school, which had been rebuilt since then, was about 50 years old or so. We decided to take this shortcut. Anyway, we were about to round the corner to the playground behind the school when my eyes were brought all the way toward the back of the soccer field, which was still fenced off by a 5 to 6 foot chain link fence. What I saw there nearly made me shit my pants. I saw a shadow of a man running on the inside of the fence, our side, running towards us. I asked my friend if she had seen that too, and she quickly responded with, "Yes, oh my god, let's go!" We backed up real quick and booted it the fuck out of there, out to the front parking lot, and running straight towards her house. Who the fuck even knows why our parents used to let us walk alone like that late at night? But needless to say, we didn't take that way home again for quite a long time. We're both going on 21, and we still talk about that night to this very day. I still get the creeps whenever I walk there at night. Last summer, 2015, my best friend and I were taking a class that met 2 nights a week for a month. One night, after dropping her off at home after class was over, I went to a festival downtown and left at around 10:30 p.m. On the way home, I decided to stop at a local park just outside the city limits, where I went often to swing and listen to music. I wasn't tired enough yet to just go home. I was there for maybe 15 to 20 minutes when another car pulled into the lot and a young couple got out. People fish at this park at night, so I didn't really think that much about it. After a few minutes though, I noticed the couple was not leaving the general area around their car. I felt like I was being watched too, so I kept swinging but turned the volume on my music down while keeping my headphones in. I was right. They were talking about me, speculating about when I was going to leave. My blood froze. I knew I had to get out of there, but in order to get back to my car, I would have to walk right past the gate to the playground and past this couple in their car. Instead, I got off the swing while acting like I was sending a text and walked to a darker area of the playground away from them, hoping I could hide in the shadows until they left. Once I was there and hidden among the dark playground equipment, I suddenly heard a third voice in the darkness, one that sounded like that of a woman who had been chain-smoking her whole life. I felt sick to my stomach when I remembered that while I was watching the young couple, a second car had pulled into the lot as well, but whoever was in it had never gotten out. It appeared they were watching me from the vehicle, or lurking around in the dark somewhere I couldn't see them. Luckily, the part of the park I was in backed up to a fence that had a tree growing up against it. I hopped it as silently as I could and decided I was going to make my way up the road where it was completely dark to go to the north entrance by foot, then circle around so I could get back to my car and get the hell out of there. I could hear the three of them arguing quite loudly with each other in the dark by now. My heart was pounding as I tiptoed along the street, silently praying I wasn't going to get abducted and murdered or something. I got to the entrance of the parking lot when there was a large bush and a portable toilet I could hide behind. That was when I heard the voice of the woman so close to me, it was almost like she was whispering in my ear. What she asked the guy and girl next made my heart stop. "Did you get rid of the body yet?" The three of them immediately started arguing again. The woman got into her car, slamming the door shut and turning the engine on. As she was pulling out of the lot, I ran across the street and hid in the shadows between a cluster of trees. Both cars pulled out of the lot within 30 seconds of each other, going in opposite directions. As soon as I was sure they weren't going to come back, and not wanting to catch a glimpse of whatever grisly crime scene they had left behind, I sprinted to my car and sped out of the park. I called the police as soon as I pulled into my grandparents' driveway. I talked with the dispatcher for 20 minutes, crying and shaking the whole time. Officers were sent to check out the area where this all took place, but they didn't find anything. I spoke with a detective one more time that night, but I was so full of adrenaline that I didn't sleep until the next day. I called my mom the next morning on her way to work and told her about what happened. Usually, she tells me I'm exaggerating and making something out of nothing, which is quite often true, but this time she was silent on the other end of the phone. After a moment, she just told me to never go to that park at night again. I never did find out what was really going on that night, but right around the time all of this happened, the police in our area were on the lookout for a man who had disappeared and supposedly been abducted. They found his body in the national park, a half-hour north from where my encounter took place 2 weeks later. We were going camping once, driving through some city. My dad was driving and my mom was in the passenger seat. I was in the back and it was evening, but not fully dark yet. We weren't really talking to each other at all. My mom was just looking out her window when all of a sudden she said, "Oh my God, do you see that?" My dad said, "Yeah, I do. I'm gonna slow down and let them pass." He slowed down, and the car on the right passed us by. I couldn't see inside, but one of their windows was down, and the arm hanging out that window looked to be that of someone impossibly thin. I asked my mom what she saw, and she said it was nothing. My dad backed her up, and they refused to tell me anything more. Years later, I asked them about it again. My mom said that what she'd seen that night was a person's skeleton. It was no mask though, because you could see through their jaws. They still had some tissues like their tongue and their eyes, but the rest was rotting and decaying. My dad backed her up again, but years later, after my mom was dead, he recanted, saying it must have been a mask, because the person's eyes appeared to be moving, and nobody could be alive and look to be in that bad of a state. A couple of years ago, I was living in Budapest. It was half study abroad, half hanging out with my family, who lived in a town about 30 minutes south. Every once in a while, I would take day trips with my friends. On one of our trips to Romania, our car broke down right at the border. One of my friends had family that didn't live too far away. It was still way too far to just walk though, so the four of us decided to hitchhike. We grabbed what we could out of the vehicle, then called her family to tell them we were on our way. We locked up the car and wrote a sign that said we were hitchhiking but would be returning for the car later. About 5 minutes after this, a van pulled over and we got inside. The guy who picked us up, Andres, was very nice. He was very interested in where we were all from, what we liked to do, where we'd traveled, what kind of things we were studying. It started to get quite dark out, and Andres here mentioned his family had a house not too far from where we were actually. We could stop there for the night and sleep over, since he was pretty tired and didn't know if he could drive us all the way to where we needed to go to. We all kind of looked around at each other, but ultimately agreed that it was rude to expect this nice man who had picked us up to drive us all throughout the night. Yes, Andres was nice, but driving up the dirt road to his house made all the hairs on my arms stand up. I would later ask my companions, and they all said the same thing. All of us got silent as we tried to take in the scenery. It looked like an Eastern European house, set far back on what used to be a farm. There was still all of the old abandoned equipment around. We unloaded and shuffled into this house, which was actually very quaint and charming. He showed us into a room off the living room that we could all sleep in for the night. We all set out our sleeping bags and kind of congregated on the floor, while Andres went into the kitchen. He started talking to his wife. "Honey, I've brought back some travelers again. They're all very nice. Some of them are American. "Ah, yes, I was going to offer them some brandy." He came back into the doorway of our room and offered us said brandy. I passed, but the others accepted. He brought us out a tray and the rest of the bottle, then disappeared again. Eventually, we all drifted off to sleep. I woke up first, got dressed, and went outside to pee. I ran into a little girl on my way back up to the house. She was incredibly shy. I asked what her name was and if she lived there too. She said she did, but kept saying her father didn't believe her. I chalked it up to either my Hungarian being rusty or her being a kid, but I told her she should come back inside because it was very cold out. She instead slunk back into an old mangled trailer she was playing inside. I went back in the house and breezed past the kitchen, where Andres was screaming out, "Why are there not enough eggs for our guests? What kind of wife are you?" When I got back to the doorway of our room, all of my companions were standing up, bags hastily packed and mouths agape. Looking behind me, I turned, and that's when I saw a scarecrow dressed up in women's clothing, sitting in an armchair at the far side of the living room. I turned back to my friends laughing and said, "Are you guys afraid of a scarecrow?" Just then, Andres came through the door, picked the scarecrow up by the arm and flung it across the room. "You are the stupidest woman in the world," he howled. "I worked so hard, and you embarrassed me." He went back into the kitchen still screaming and now rifling through drawers. I turned to my friends, and we all immediately agreed it was time to leave right now. The things Andres was saying got worse and worse. "I killed the last one. I can kill you too." We stood there as a group, frozen. My friend Libby turned around and saw a window, so we decided to jump through it to get out of the house. She was the first one out, and when she landed, she made this weird squishing sound. My friend Jenny popped her head out the window and then started screeching and backing away from it. At this point, Andres had started stabbing the scarecrow with a big knife. We were all trying to get the hell out of this house. The two of us still inside pushed Jenny out of the way, not really caring why she was screaming because Andres was packing a knife now. Finally, I jumped out and landed in what can only be animal remains. There was blood and guts filling this deep trench next to the guy's house. There was also a lovely portrait of a family painted on the side, using what looked like blood from this giant gaping hole. The four of us, bloody and shaking, were still able to hear Andres killing his scarecrow wife. We hightailed it the hell out of there back to the main road, and we decided against getting into another car. Instead, we ran all the way back to our old car. We took a break off from day tripping for a while. This happened about 6 months ago. I was 22 at the time, and my daughter was only 4. I lived in a 2-story house with just me, my daughter, and my husband. I was taking at-home classes to be an iPhone specialist, starting at 5 p.m. and ending at 10 p.m., Monday through Friday. My husband had left for his 2 weeks of training that he does every year for the military, so it was just me, my daughter, and our pit bull mix Mavis at home. I had just finished up my classes for the week and had the weekend free. I decided to go to my mother's house until Sunday. I packed up my stuff and my daughter's stuff, and we went over for the weekend. We returned home on Sunday to find that someone had broken into our home. There were muddy footprints and windows were open, but nothing was missing at all. I was going to call the police, but my sister's husband explained the cops wouldn't do anything. Nothing happened that night, but the next day my mother came over to pick my daughter up so I could do my classes without worrying what she was getting into. They left and I went to watch the classes upstairs. I put my headphones on so I could hear my instructor teaching the class, but I swear I began to hear things downstairs. I even texted my mom and told her I was hearing something weird going on. It was really creeping me out. She assured me it was probably just Mavis because she'd locked everything up tight when she left, and no one could possibly get in. I agreed, thinking I was probably just freaking myself out. I continued listening to my instructor's teaching when I swear I heard footsteps on the stairs. I hurried up and took my headset off, but when I listened in, I couldn't hear anything. I walked down the stairs and didn't see anything either. I went back to my class and brushed it off. At 10 p.m., my class was finally over. My mom decided to just keep my daughter there with her for the night. I was doing my homework with Mavis upstairs with me, when all of a sudden, she started barking and growling and sprinted down the stairs. Now, Mavis usually barks and growls at the slightest of noises outside, so I didn't really think that much of it. I decided that maybe I should check it out anyway this time though, because of what had happened earlier. Again though, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I went back upstairs. I was finally done with my homework, and it was about midnight now. I went downstairs and called my mom like I do every night. We were talking, and I decided to open my daughter's door and peek my head in. I don't know why I did this, because my daughter was at my mom's for the entire night. It was just a habit. I guess I should have mentioned earlier that when you look into my daughter's room, her bed is on the far wall, a good ways away from the door. Because of this, you can clearly see underneath her bed as soon as you look in. I opened the door, and to my horror, I saw a man was hiding underneath her bed. I froze and didn't move. I just stood there in shock. After what felt like minutes, I slowly shut the door and whispered into my phone to my mom. "There's a man in my house under my daughter's bed." My mom was terrified and screamed at me to get outside and stay on the phone with her. She had my brother call the police, so I ran outside with Mavis and waited for them to arrive. After about 3 minutes, they came and searched my house, but they found no one. They did discover my bathroom window was wide open. They happened to shine their light at the living room window, and I could clearly see 2 huge handprints where they'd slid the window down. The cops waited for my mom and brother to get there, and while we were waiting, they told me about this man who usually stayed 2 houses down from mine with his parents. Both of his parents had a pretty bad drug habit, and this guy had been known to put women in the hospital trying to kill them. What scares me even more is that since we bought this house, my daughter has been terrified and always told my mom she wanted to stay with her because it wasn't safe at mommy's house. I didn't really think too much of it at the time. I thought maybe it was just a new place, and you know how kids are with new places. After this whole thing happened though, I stayed with my mom until my husband came home. We decided to ask our daughter what scared her so much about this house. What she told me absolutely terrified me. She said that at night while her dad and I were asleep, monsters would come to her window and try to get inside. She said there was a boy monster and a girl monster. The next day we installed alarms on all the windows and security lights. I can't stop questioning why this man was under my daughter's bed. Was he waiting for me to go to sleep, or was he waiting for my mom to bring my daughter back home? And for me to put her to bed, I get sick to my stomach thinking about what could have happened to her. It all began on a beautiful day at the beginning of autumn in 1998. I live in a small town called Grantham in Lincolnshire, United Kingdom. I was out with a couple of friends, and it was coming up to the end of the summer holidays. I was at a friend's house when I decided to nip home to get a drink. My 2 friends walked down with me, as it was only around the corner, a 5-minute walk away from my house. I went in and they waited outside for me, or so I thought. While I was inside, I got real thirsty and drank about 3 pints of water before going back out. When I got outside though, I realized there was no sign of my friends around. I looked up and down the street for them. I looked up and down the street for them. Down the street, about 4 houses down from mine, there were a couple of very large trees about 18 feet high, overhanging the fence at the front. As I looked down that way, I saw 2 pairs of legs hanging down, as if 2 people were up in the tree hiding. I thought it must be my friends, messing around with me. I started walking down there, shouting that I could see them and to stop messing around. As I shouted to them, whoever this was sort of jumped over the fence. When they entered the next garden over, they went to a gate at the side of the property, which was about 8 feet high, and proceeded to climb over that too. I didn't understand how they'd just done all this so fast, but I still wasn't fazed by it. I shouted again for them to stop messing around. Then I had an idea. I'd run down quickly and catch them when they came out of the next garden. I proceeded to the next garden over, but I couldn't believe what I was looking at now. There in this garden stood 2 people, but they were not my friends. At first, they looked really odd. There was a man about 50, wearing a large trench coat that went all the way down to his feet. I could see he had large black boots on. As my eyes moved up, I saw his hands were very pale, and his fingernails were extremely long and overgrown, like big claws. They were a really dirty yellow color. His mouth was open wide enough to show he had sharp discolored teeth as well, and had a large pointed nose. When I looked at his eyes, they almost looked jet black. You'd never believe what I was talking about if you hadn't seen it yourself. I instantly froze on the spot. It felt like time was frozen. No one was around, and nothing was moving either. It felt like there was no wind. All I could do was stare into this guy's eyes. I knew they were staring right back at me. I was aware of the other person nearby as well. He was much younger and dressed in more modern clothes for the time. I couldn't see this young one's face as I was stuck staring into those deep pits that were the eyes of the first man. I'll tell you now, I've never felt so terrified in all my life. After what felt like hours, I managed to break the man's gaze and run home. When I got indoors, I just about bawled my eyes out. I think it was the shock and the horror of knowing those people were wandering around in broad daylight. I never knew what was going on until last night, when I discovered some stories of black-eyed children. After reading those stories, I realized that maybe that's what those guys could have been. It wasn't a nighttime door visit, though. I hope I never have to experience that again. I'm 36 now, but the following happened to me when I was 19 years old. A quick backstory is that I was and still am a volunteer firefighter in a small West Australian town in the southwest. In addition to the normal volunteer firefighting ins and outs of attending things, I was also involved in the sports side of the fire brigade as well. This was comprised of individual and team events. The fire brigade you belonged to was your team. Across Western Australia, there were about 30 such brigades, and between October and April, we would travel around and compete with each other. We had traveled to Geraldton to compete in the state championships in 1999. I had, through immense hard work, won the Championship Fireman Award and was at the hosting fire brigades after the event's celebration. I was enjoying myself with my team, drinking beer and socializing, which started at around 5 p.m. I'll admit I was pretty damn drunk at this point. There were a shitload of people around, and a lot of my time was spent talking to officials, older members, and chatting with friends and catching up. I had not really gotten my full drink on yet. I really needed to take a piss though, so I went around the corner and started to piss in the garden, like I had done a few times already. Every other bloke at the party was doing the same thing. While I was doing this though, I got a phone call from an unknown number. Being away from all the noise of the party, I answered this. I remembered the guy on the other end asking for someone I didn't know. They ended the call after perhaps 10 or 15 seconds, simply saying, "Sorry, wrong number." I finished my piss and went straight back to the party. When I returned, I was absolutely in shock. Everyone else had disappeared practically. It was dead quiet. Every table and chair was neatly stacked with all the rubbish cleared. The lights were off, the doors were locked, there were no cars at all. It was completely dead, with not a sound at all. I was extremely confused. I took my phone out and saw it was just after 4 a.m. Well, what the fuck just happened? I checked through my phone and it showed dozens of missed calls, 30 or 40 text messages of people searching for me and looking for where I'd gone to. I called up my mate and made it back to my hotel. Over the next few days, I confirmed with many people that I had been standing in the circle talking to everyone when I excused myself to take a piss after receiving a phone call. That was the last anyone saw of me that night. Where I'd pissed was where everyone else was doing it, so it's impossible I could have gone there unnoticed. A group of friends had searched the entire area for me, but apparently I had just disappeared altogether. I still have no idea what really happened that night, but it was extremely weird. Throughout the days, we take our 2 dogs outside to their kennels so they can get out of the house for a while and run and play. These are not small dogs, mind you. One is a black lab husky mix, and the other one is a full-blooded Staffordshire Terrier pit bull. The kennels are placed at the edge of the yard near the woods. The woods are big and large enough to take an entire day to go hiking through them. Lately, when it gets dark, the dogs seem to be very on edge. They'll bark and whine toward the house to come in. At first, I figured they just wanted to get back inside. But now I'm actually starting to think they might be scared for some reason. 3 nights ago when I went to get them, it was already dark, but we have a security light so it wasn't pitch black or anything like that. I got to the front of the first kennel and noticed both dogs were being unusually quiet. They always barked at me excitedly when I'd go to get them, but now they were dead silent. This did weird me out a bit, but not to the point of being scared. I will admit there was a certain uneasiness in the air though, something I couldn't quite explain. It felt sort of electric, like I was about to be shocked or something. The longer I was there, the more uneasy I felt. I started getting the first dog out when I heard a heavy snap in the woods near the kennels. I froze, and the dogs froze too. By this point in time, I was so on edge that if someone had spoken out to me, I would have jumped and screamed, possibly even ran away. This ominous feeling in the air just kept getting thicker and thicker. My lab had her bushy tail stuffed underneath her and was whining. This didn't make me feel any better. My pit bull was as far away from the woods as she could get, whimpering for me to come get her as well. I could only take 1 dog in at a time because they'd get too excited and even sometimes try to fight. I avoided that at all costs, so I felt bad leaving my pit out there by herself. I had to do it though. As I walked away, she barked this kind of high-pitched whining type of bark at me. I had never heard her do this before. The lab couldn't get into the house quick enough. I went back for the other one and dreaded every step. Her kennel was right at the base of the woods. I would have to turn my back on them to open her door and get her out. The air felt heavy and stale, with an unpleasant smell like that of dead skunk. I approached the kennel, and another snap was heard. I was about ready to run for it, but I didn't want to leave my dog, who had her head down defensively, facing the woods outside. I could barely make it, to be honest. It felt like trying to walk through water. I was terrified. As I reached the door, I heard a heavy breathing behind me. I got my dog out. She was scared too, but she started growling at the area behind me. I was frozen in place. That heavy breathing continued for about a minute before I heard steps coming out of the woods towards both of us. We took off at the same time. A terrifying scream came from the base of the woods. I didn't dare to look back to see what it was though. I just ran all the way home, my pit bull pulling me all the way back. I got in and flipped off all the lights. I stared out the window at those woods. I could see that something was clearly moving around outside, but it was just out of reach of the light. It moved back and forth for about 5 minutes before it disappeared back into the woods. It took me forever to fall asleep that night because I was so scared that every little noise freaked me out. The next night I went to get the dogs earlier, right around dusk or so. I thought all was good until I was getting my pity out again. A huge snapping sound like a tree branch cracking rang out. It sounded pretty far away, so I hurried up and got my dog and started toward the house. A few steps away from the kennel, I heard something quite big charging toward me from inside the woods. We ran again. Whatever it was appeared to follow for a while, then retreated back into the woods once we were inside. Now, every night since then, I hear sounds coming out of the woods like branches cracking and things being thrown around or something knocking against the trees. I'm absolutely terrified. I no longer even take my dogs down there. I just take them for walks during the day instead and make sure we're all in bed before dusk. I don't know what to do. I'm thinking of buying a gun, but I'm not sure how much that will actually help. During 1999, I worked briefly as a vacuum cleaner salesman. Yes, the job was as terrible as it sounds. It also required very late nights, as I was often at customers' homes until around 9 p.m. before having to go back to the head office to check in, then drive back home. Often, I wouldn't even arrive home until 12 or 1 a.m. in the morning. I was working late this one particular night and was on the home stretch around 10 miles from home when my old crappy Ford Fiesta started to overheat. I knew the car wouldn't make it home, and I had no other choice than to pull over on top of the big, dark, deserted mountain next to my town. My hometown was literally the last town before there were only mountains and forests for countless miles on end. As I pulled into the mountain parking area with steam pouring out of my engine, this is 100% true by the way, I could see a white human figure. Obviously surprised the car was pulling into a deserted parking space in the middle of the night, this figure ran directly in front of my headlights. As it sprinted from the edge of the clear side of the parking area and into the forest on the other side, I could see it had no clothes. They also appeared almost luminous and reflective in my lights. To say I shit myself is a bit of an understatement. My eyes nearly popped out of my sockets when they ran in front of me. I realized that I was now stuck in a dead car on a deserted mountain in the middle of the night with no mobile phone signal. This was back in the days when mobile phones were just starting to become popular, so large chunks of the country were missing from network coverage. I had no choice but to sit there for an hour until my car cooled down. They'd given up the ghost pretty much the second I pulled in, so I just sat there in my car alone, staring directly into the forest where I'd saw them run. I had no weapon and no way to make contact with anybody to let them know where I was. There was no passing traffic to possibly flag down for help. I knew for a fact I had actually seen someone there, and it was not a trick of the light. That much was clear. I discounted any other animal that populated the Welsh mountains, as I was certain I'd seen a two-legged humanoid. Roughly a human head, body, arms, and legs. The obvious answer was that it was some very strange man, who for some reason was either wearing white or completely naked. Since we were miles away from the nearest home, and I was the only car around, I didn't know why someone would have spent hours walking through thick forests just to hang out in an empty parking area in the middle of the forest. Eventually, my car cooled down enough for me to limp back home. Nobody really believed me when I told them what I saw, though. All my friends were adamant I must have seen a sheep or something, but to this very day, I swear that I saw something that night, something different than I've ever seen in the forest before. I've been camping many times, biking and hiking, and I've never seen anything like that again. Whenever I go there now, though, I'm always aware of the possible presence of someone else being out in the woods with me. I was living with my then boyfriend and his flatmate about this time last year. I just got in from work on a Sunday night, at around 11 p.m. or so. I work in a bar, by the way. We'd all decided to go smoke a joint in the park next door to our flat. Now, the area we lived in was actually very nice. Never had any problems, very quiet community. As we got about halfway through the park, some random guy started cycling towards us. He got about a meter past us, then fell off his bike. We all ignored it and carried on walking until he randomly started to scream at us. "Hey, you want to fight?" He ran over and started pushing the guys I was with around and screaming in my face. He was a big guy, and we were all pretty freaked out. We turned around and started to head home. That's when the guy climbed back on his bike and started chasing after us. He was screaming, "I have a knife, and I'm gonna kill you all." We all legged it back to the flat, but you have to key in a code. We got in just in time. We didn't get the chance to close the door properly though, as the guy shoved his way in. We had to run up 3 flights of stairs. I was at the very back. We got into the flat just in time. The man started banging on the door shortly after. We didn't call the police in the end. Probably should have in hindsight, but we were all pretty shaken up. We later ordered a pizza, and when the pizza guy came up to the flat, we asked him to make sure the guy was not still there. I was once walking through the woods in a rather remote area by myself, as I needed to take a shortcut from where I was going to arrive in time. After a few minutes, though, I thought I saw something moving in the bushes right next to me. It was just about getting dark, so there was still enough light out to see movement, but not really enough to see what was doing the moving. I just shook it off, surely a squirrel or some wild animal. After a few hundred meters deeper in, though, I noticed strange noises coming from behind me. It sounded like heavy breathing, like the rattling sound you'd make if you had pneumonia or something. As I turned around, I couldn't see anything. It had gotten darker very quickly. I'm a guy in his mid-20s and in good condition, so I thought, fuck it, let's run for a few minutes until I'm back on track. I tried to focus on my steps so I didn't trip on a root or a stone or something in the darkness. As I slowed down because of a big dead tree blocking my path, I could hear the breathing behind me again, now much closer than it had been before. Whatever this thing was, it was clearly following me. Because I had been running, I was too loud to notice it. I jumped over that lying trunk and turned around, ready to face whatever was following me. And there they were. There was a naked man, eyes glowing in the darkness. You could see the yellow shimmer of their teeth with their mouth opened, drool seemingly pooling down. I pulled out my pocket knife, prepared to fight this unusual man. Luckily, they must have been intimidated by the sight of my knife because they dashed right back into the bushes where they came from, and I went the rest of my way in peace.